on.
Yeah, don't be shy.
Can't hide.
Bite.
Can't hide.
Fall asleep, that's okay, but.
Let's move forward.
Yeah,
Yeah,
please come
come
on
on
in.
in.
I'm sure
Fill
you're
it in.
going to appreciate that. So, we think we have some people have opted to stay outside this evening. But that's okay.
They're missing out.
They are missing out. So yeah, come on in. Thank you for coming out. And please, if you want to go make yourself a bigger plate, please do. Please do. So I just want to welcome you all to Roaring Fork Conservancy. I'm Christina Mendez, the Director of Community Outreach. And I want to introduce to you Rick Lafaro. He's our Executive Director.
Greetings, good evening. I think I have seen and spoken to all of you at a previous time, maybe, but welcome to the River Center.
And then Chad Rudo is our Water Quality Program Manager. And then this is Kara with Riverside West. So I'll introduce her a little bit more here in a few minutes. But just to give you a quick little introduction to Roaring Fork Conservancy, this is our 23rd year as the watershed organization for the Roaring Fork Valley. And we're really excited to welcome you here at the River Center because this has been a dream of ours for many years, and we have hosted other Watershed Institute types of events off-site, and so now it's nice for us to be able to say, come to like our facility, come to our home, and to bring water leaders like Kara here is really exciting for us as well. So thank you for being a part of that. So those of you that don't know what the Roaring Fork Conservancy does, our mission is very simple. We want to inspire individuals like yourselves to explore, value, and protect the Roaring Fork watershed. And we do that through our watershed science and policy projects and our education programs. And so this is an example of some of our education programs, but we're also in the classroom. And then in the summer, we have a lot of adult and family programs. So if you're interested, we can talk about that after the fact. But what is the Watershed Institute? The Berkshire Watershed Institute is actually named after one of our donors, like from almost day one, Carter and Dane Berkshire. And it was actually their idea. They're like, wouldn't it be nice to have this Watershed Institute where water leaders would come here and we would talk about water at an elevated level beyond the Roaring Fork watershed? Because the Roaring Fork watershed here is a small piece in a very large system, the Colorado River system, that feeds 40 million people. And our land mass here is only 0.5% of the complete Colorado River basin, but our river contributes about 10% of the total flow of the Colorado River. So we have a lot of water here. So what we're doing here tonight is we are elevating this conversation of water. Kara works for Rivers Edge West. They're based in Grand Junction, but their work is all throughout the West. And so I'm gonna turn the show over to Kara so she can talk about tamarisk and other invasive plants that we need to be paying attention to. But really quick, since this is the third speaker in our three-part speaker series, who's been here for the first two about Colorado Compact and cloud seeding? A few of you have been here.
I made one.
Okay, that counts, that counts. For those of you that weren't able to make it, we have all those videos available.
And would this one be?
This is Facebook Live right now if everyone wants to wave the little iPad. It's not focused on anybody except the screen and whoever's standing up here. But yes, after this, you will be able to see it. It's on Facebook right now. It'll also be on our YouTube channel tomorrow. So it will be saved in perpetuity, so you can watch the other lectures' presentations as well. After Kara's presentation, Chad will come up here and actually discuss with all of you very briefly where we stand on tamarisk and invasive plants here in the Roaring Fork Valley, what we've done about them, what we're doing about them, and there's ways that you can help. Okay? So without further ado, Kara, I'm going to introduce you, but I always get your name wrong.
Oh, yeah.
How do we say your last name?
Cucaratus.
There you go. There's going to be a quiz later today.
Yeah.
If you spell it right, we'll give you an extra glass of wine. So Kara's been with Rivers Edge West as their outreach and education coordinator for almost 6 years.
Yeah.
So welcome to Roaring Fork Valley.
Thanks for having me. Yeah. And thanks again for joining us. Yeah. All right. So how many here are familiar with Rivers Edge West or the Tamarisk Coalition? You heard of the Tamarisk Coalition? Awesome. So we used to be called Tamarisk Coalition because, as that states, we focused on tamarisk mostly in our early years, but we have since expanded in many ways, in many directions. Now we work all across the West. And we focus not just on tamarisk, we work and focus on river health as a whole, so addressing different invasive species, hydrology, effects of changing climate, all these different sorts of fun things. So we thought that it warranted a name change. So really we focus on restoring the habitat along the river's edge in the western United States. So River's Edge West seemed to be the most appropriate and had a free website open. So, so yeah, we are based in Grand Junction, but we have a staff person in Flagstaff, Arizona, who works a lot with the Verde and the Gila rivers. And I didn't bring it today, but in our annual report, you can pick up a copy on your way out, or up here, you can see a real comprehensive look more of what we do. But today, I thought I would just kind of talk through with you why we do what we do, why it's important work, caring about some plant species and how that impact trickles throughout the community. So, how many of you here are familiar with tamarisk plant? Okay, good. Russian olive, also? Okay, sweet. What do anyone here work in like the environmental field or no? Okay.
I'm associated with
Okay.
it. I made a D, so I learned all about this in ecology for planners in grad school.
Oh, neat.
And on this particular paper, which my professor currently was like the premier expert.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Oh,
I got a D
was
on it.
Was it chair? No?
He was part of CUD and
Okay, just wondering. It's trying to read a lot of papers.
yeah, I'm sure. And if I remembered his name,
Okay.
you would probably know him.
Well, that's cool. All right. Well, I'll give you the basics, and then we'll move through and talk just a little bit more about what we do. But I do like to start. I should probably turn this on. I do like to start with this general photo, no matter who I'm talking to, just because I love the contrast that this shows. So this is actually taken in the headwaters of the Verde River, but this just shows the big contrast between obviously our desert landscape and that riparian corridor. Riparian is the same as Riverside. It's those green strips of vegetation that provide so much life, so much habitat, food, and shelter for our wildlife that rely on them. So just how important these areas are. And one thing that I found really interesting when I first started looking into this work was that there's only 1% of land in the United States is considered a riparian area. So really small sliver of space as this habitat. Yeah, almost all wildlife rely on these areas at some point in their lifetime. So almost 80% of wildlife are going to be, whether they're migrating, stopping on their way, and their migration patterns for some food or shelter, or their whole lives. Like, this is some critical habitat that we need to make sure has healthy habitat for them to use. And we've had a big, significant loss of these riparian areas for various reasons. Development, obviously, is one of them, but these invasive plants that I'm going to be talking about have had a big impact on this habitat. So, and when we talk about it, this is, again, pretty basic stuff, but I like to remind everybody biodiversity is what we're after here. Diverse plants in this riparian zone mean diverse wildlife are going to be able to live here. And all these wildlife are pretty picky about where they live and what they eat. So if it becomes overtaken with just one invasive plant, that may not provide the shelter that they need, or the insects that they want to eat may not live in those tamarisk and Russian olive trees. It impacts the whole ecosystem, just your usual local life stuff. But you know, the least turned, a couple examples to bring it home, is an endangered species that lives in nests in cobble bars. And when you have these invasive tamarisk plants, they move into the cobble bars and they can live there long term. So you get a loss of habitat in that sense, so it can impact bird species. We have, I'll talk about it a little bit later, but with these invasive plants, they have a way about channelizing the river. But we really like, for fish habitat, as one example, rivers and streams that are able to meander and move and bend and create side channels and backwaters for fish habitat. And when we have invasive plants that move in, they have the ability to slowly encroach and take away these back channels. And when you get these big flood events that happen, the stream banks aren't able to move and be pushed around where you create a side channel, because you have now this really big invasive plant with these robust roots holding that bank in place. So we're seeing a reduction in our backwaters and side channels. And of course, we've got our larger birds of prey here, so they are going to be wanting to nest in more mature trees, like our big old cottonwoods. And with the loss of that habitat, they're forced to go somewhere else or compete for places to live. So I just always think that's interesting. And to give you an idea what I mean when I say a healthy riverside habitat, how many of you guys like to recreate on the river, find yourself out there a lot? Pretty lucky that we live where we do, probably familiar. So, but in my mind, I'm thinking of healthy riverside habitat is lots of different plants that are native, ideally, but it also multi-storied vegetation. So not just one of the same plant. Multi-storied, kind of like steps. So your lower story would be some grasses. So we have some willows down here and some native grasses. And then in the mid-story is some larger bushes and shrubs like Mexico privet. And then we've got these taller species up here, which are our cottonwood trees. So great options for wildlife. And this stuff will move and flow with the stream. So good habitat. When we have an invasive species move in, let's say Russian olive, this is what the stream will look like in the aftermath of an invasive plant moving in. So you obviously lose your plant diversity. You lose your ability as a person to access the river, pull out your boat, have lunch on that little beach. All sorts of effects that happen as a result. This is actually a before and after photo in reverse. So this was a before photo in Escalante Neon Canyon. You can see the photo point here. This is your, your point to compare. So the crews went through and removed the Russian olive, and within 2 years' time, it's all passively revegetated with native plants. So it's a pretty neat story. Escalante River Watershed Partnership has been doing amazing things out there.
Do you replant the native plants, or they just come back?
Depends on where you are. Depends on your how much water you have in your system, how disturbed the soil is, how much money you have to replant. So one of the things we do is help raise money for partnerships like the Escalante to actually buy seeds and plants. But in a lot of cases, things will come back on their own if
Is
hydrology.
most of that just native plants coming back?
Yeah. And I think a big part is hydrology. How much water are you naturally having come through to saturate the soils? And if you're in a place where you perhaps don't have as much flow, you will probably want to spend a little more money to irrigate those trees and plants once you plant them. But luckily this is a great site for that, not having to do that. So, yeah. And then in the case of tamarisk, that's what it looks like. So pretty similar, right? Pretty similar structure. And I'm gonna focus. Well, we talk about cottonwoods and willows a lot just because they're like the two most prevalent ones along our streams that are native, but we have a lot of other ones that we're looking at here. When we consider our restoration plans, it depends where you are and when we're planting as a result. So desert and Goodings willow, cottonwood, box elder, silverleaf buffaloberry looks a lot like Russian olive, but definitely not the same. So we get that confused a lot. Yeah, lots of good species that we can work with for our restoration. And then I did want to talk about this, and there was a lot of words on this slide, but there's a lot of things going on, essentially, that helps invasive plants become so prolific in our river systems. So we actually introduced this plant to the United States, settlers did in the 1800s, and so that was one thing, right? We introduced this plant without its natural predators to keep their population in check. So that plant now just has unbounded potential, if you will. One of the other things that happened with our rivers was that we, in order to provide for this development in the Southwest, Phoenix, Vegas, the whole deal, we needed to figure out how to supply water to these places. So the damming of rivers was a necessity that caused huge shifts in our hydrology and our river systems. So what you have is these large flood events that we used to be getting, and now we have controlled flow, so we're not getting these giant flood events. And one of the things I recently learned was, when do cottonwoods go to seed? When do our native cottonwoods germinate? Anyone know?
June, May, June?
Yeah, May, spring. So when we normally, historically, get these big spring runoffs from the snow melt, in the spring, the rivers start to swell and overflow the banks. They start to saturate the banks, depositing fresh nutrients and sediment. That is the exact time that the cottonwood seeds are germinating and have their chance to grow. That's the one time a year that they're putting out seeds. So now that we have less overbank flooding, we're seeing less cottonwood recruitment. Fewer cottonwoods are just growing up naturally on their own with that altered flow regimen. So with that and the introduction of these invasive plants, we're seeing that these plants have a bit of a leg up, the invasive plants in numerous ways. We're also noticing that we know that the banks now are getting a buildup of nutrients, just like taking a shower and cleaning off all the dirt you have. When you get those flood events coming through, it's cleansing the soil with a lot of that excess stuff. It's specifically a lot of salts that build up in the soil. And cottonwoods can sustain about 2,000 parts per million of salinity salt in the soil, whereas tamarisk they're happy with salt, they don't mind. 36,000 parts per million is what a tamarisk can be found growing in. So they are highly adapted to very salty soils, versus our native plants that just aren't, they haven't adapted to it, it's not part of their natural habitat. So there's a lot of factors that contribute to what's going on, and our role now is trying to manage this invasive plant spread so that we're never going to get rid of these invasive plants, but we're trying to get it so that it's in more of an ecological balance. So we have invasive plants that are able to coexist with our native plants. So with that said, any questions about that? It's a very heavy slide there, so good job. Okay, here's another one. This is a hydrograph, at least great. Just wanted to give you a visual of what I mean by these flows. So this is back in 1928. So the blue is just the amount of water coming through the system, at least Ferry. So you can see we've got these pretty big spikes in water coming through, and then big drops, big spikes, and so forth. So we have this really natural variability that's happening, which our cottonwoods have been accustomed to surviving on. And then here we filled Lake Powell, 1964 time period, so we had a big drop in our flows. And then here was the 1983 flood. I don't know if you guys are familiar with when that went down, but I'm from Grand Junction, so all the cottonwoods along our river are all about the same age from that 83 flood, because the banks overflowed and the cottonwoods were able to take root. And now what we have, these flood events, they're still happening, but really in comparison, we are just not getting anywhere near the amount of flows that we used to be getting that were necessary for a lot of these native species to easily survive. So I just think that's a good tidbit to keep in mind in this whole conversation. Any questions on that? Okay, super. So, other invaders. We talk about tamarisk and Russian olive a lot because they're the two main woody invasives that we focus on. Tamarisk is a rapid invader. You know how cottonwoods germinate just through that springtime? Tamarisk will put out seeds throughout the whole growing season. Russian olive is slower to move in, but once they're there, their seeds remain viable for way longer. So equally as difficult of plants to deal with. Tamarisk has gotten more press because it is such a quick invader. And I think Russian olive was coming up with getting more funding for research on this plant, but just as bad. So also kochia, Russian knapweed, all sorts of different invasive different weeds that we work to deal with. So,
Kara, quick
yes.
question. So tamarisk's other name is salt cedar. Does that refer back to what you were saying before, that it can tolerate a lot of salt in the soil?
Yes. Have you guys familiar with salt cedar? Same thing, tamarisk salt cedar. Yeah, it also makes the soil saltier too. So, that's some pretty crazy changes to its habitat. Salt cedar has these very robust roots, like I talked about. They go very deep into the ground, into the lower soil profiles of the ground, and they pull up salts from down there. The salts travel up through its bark into its leaves, and now you have these salty leaves. It's like oily salt. It actually tastes like salt if you want to taste them, tamarisk. And so then, obviously in the fall time, when those leaves fall, you have this salty leaf litter being decomposed and broken down to the top layer of soil. So it's just even further adding to the salt load on the soil. So, yeah, unfortunate. When we do these restoration projects, it takes a long time to restore an ecosystem. A big component of it is just the soil amending. The soil is so packed with salt that it takes some time before you get native plants that will take. So it's another challenge. So we talked about this pretty much, but salt cedar tamarisk came from Asia and Northern Africa. It was brought in as an ornamental for erosion control, for windbreaks. They create great long fences, and you don't have to take care of them because they'll grow. So it was a good idea at the time. Obviously, they realized it started to take over and outcompete our native plants. But now we have, a significant amount of vegetation. This is just saying here, 50% to 100% of native vegetation has been displaced within major streams. So, and that's a really old statistic. And here, just to give you a better visual of what we're looking at when we're on rivers, this whole area is a tamarisk thicket, monotypic stand, just one plant. So we've completely lost that diversity for wildlife. How many of you are boaters in this room or fishermen? Okay, you might have asked already, but if you're boating on the river and you have a campsite that you normally can count on for having a place to sleep, over time these campsites have been inundated with these plants, rendering them inaccessible. So a lot of work has been done with BLM and different land management agencies to basically keep back a lot of these invasive plants so that the public can recreate in them, in and around them. So,
Kara, real quickly, if you could go back to that slide.
yeah.
Is all of the downstream or upstream riparian vegetation that you see in that picture also tamarisk?
Most likely, yes. Yeah. I mean, if you've been out on rivers boating before, you know that it's just, if one river has it, depending on what agency's managing it and how they're managing it, it'll be everywhere. So, I actually don't remember what else I was thinking, but yeah, it's a lot. You can see these are the people down here for scale. So, yeah.
Do their seeds also then get transported downstream?
They do, yeah. So, they float through wind, and they can be in water for long periods of time, for like 70 days or so, and still be fine. So, they have some serious advantages for sure. But all hope is not lost. So again, just your overview. I wanted to bring in some to show you, but I couldn't because they're not in season or leafed out yet. But this is the flowering tamarisk. Does look really pretty, if you will, and then seed dispersal by wind. Of course, longer blooms, spring to fall, very drought and flood tolerant, very salt tolerant. They don't need much, and they are super resilient to fire, which we're finding to be a really big issue lately. So I guess this is a fill in my question I like to do to everyone, but how many of you here think that we know it outcompetes native plants and reduces plant diversity? I just told you all these things, so this is a poorly placed slide. But basically, the point of this is that tamarisk does all these things. It outcompetes native plants, increases frequency of fires, it makes soil saltier, limits our use of the river, and channelizes the river. It is all of the above. So,
Does it increase the frequency?
Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to ask the same question. How does it increase the frequency of fire?
I actually have some slides that'll show you. We'll go back to this in a second. Hang on, don't look at that. Oh, jeez. Okay, well, here we go. So the fire that we're, basically, tamarisk has, here's a better slide. So it has a high surface to volume ratio, so it literally burns hotter and ignites quicker. They have really thin branches, but they're high densities. So in actual test comparisons, they found that tamarisk will actually ignite quicker than our native plants. So cottonwoods have broader leaves. They just don't ignite as quickly. So it's a big issue that we've been finding with tamarisk that has invaded along our communities, along campsites, anywhere near towns and homes. So it's been a big mitigation project. This picture has been, was taken in the Dubec Canyon. Have you guys driven that corridor on I-70? So before these riparian zones, they're not accustomed to fire. This is not a part of their natural process. And so the native plants do not recoup after it as quickly. And riparian zones were typically used and known as a fire break. It would help be a barrier from fires to spread, because those plants would not catch on fire very easily. They were very moist and they just weren't very flammable. Now that we have this infestation of tamarisk along the rivers, it is actually just acting as a pathway for wildfire. So if we go back a slide here, we have a fuel ladder down our entire river now, where normally we would have a cottonwood here and a cottonwood way down some space away with some minimal shrubs in between. We wouldn't have as much fuel for our fires, but obviously now we have got a good deal of it. So we are working with, actually in Grand Junction there's a fire coalition that we're working with to mitigate some of those risks to the community. But it's something that we are working with to educate folks about all over the place. That Island Acres fire, for example, I mean, that whole area was inundated with tamarisk, and it was just a fire that started on the side of the road, and it just caught, and there was tamarisk there, and it just took it down the whole corridor. We're in all those cottonwoods that are great habitat for all those eagles up there. All those cottonwoods are now dead, so we're trying to figure out, we're leaving the cottonwoods where it's not a risk to public safety, but, what are we gonna do now? We need to, plant some cottonwoods, get some native plants back in before the secondary weeds move in and kind of take over that habitat. So, yeah, fire is a big one.
Does the fire kill the tamarisk? It does not. Another slide.
So, within the first year, it can grow 6 feet tall. So they're just nuts. So that's what we're finding. If you don't get in right away, you gotta have funding in place. If you do have a fire that comes through and does this, you want to have that money available to throw a bunch of native seeds down, get some native plants in there before these guys will come back and just start taking over the place. So that problem continues. So it's really hard on the soil when you've got a fire and all of it burns and leaches, like it just burns out the nutrients. It's not actually great in the riparian zone. So, yeah. But any other questions about the fire aspect? Okay. This is a question. There was some fake news that went around about tamarisk, and I'm wondering what you guys think. Raise your hand if you think tamarisk consumes 200 gallons a day. Okay. What about 20 gallons a day? Those are your two options. So, one time there was an article that was not published. It was just put out. Nobody had reviewed it at all, but it had said tamarisk consumes 200 gallons a day. And then there was a bunch of push to remove tamarisk because of the water savings, because it takes so much more water. In fact, cottonwoods and tamarisk, tree for tree, take up about the same amount of water. So they each consume, this is the quiz that you already saw the answer to, so they consume about the same amount of water, but the cases where we know tamarisk does consume more water is that when you have one tamarisk, you have thousands of them. So in their sheer numbers, yes, we do have higher water consumption because there's more of them than cottonwoods. We also know that these tamarisk trees are growing on the upper floodplains, the higher benches where you have xeric species, less water consuming plants. So their taproot, this is a tamarisk, sorry, this is a NASA photo, so it's pretty weird, but the root system down here is huge in comparison to our cottonwood on the left side. So it's just able to reach more water. So in those cases it does consume more water, but we just had it for a long time it was, I heard it consumes 200 gallons a day, and that's just not quite that amount. But it's still significant, it's still a reason for restoration, but not quite to that extreme, so it's good. Okay. So channelizing rivers, we talked about that. Really just the impacts there's plenty of them. And for us, it's been really cool for me to see in our own town how invasive plant removal has basically changed the way we look at our rivers. So in Grand Junction, have you guys been to Grand Junction before? If you go...
Yes, it's not that far away.
Okay, I don't know.
We all
I don't come out here very often,
fire.
Okay. I'm just saying. So if you go over the bridge, there's the bridge that goes into town. It used to be this junkyard, and it was the first view people got of Grand Junction. They used to call it Grand Junk Town. And so we wanted to get rid of that. This was back in the 80s. And so they got rid of the junk cars, and it's right along the river. And it's really nice if there wasn't so much stuff there. So they got rid of the junk cars. Then the floods came through, deposited all these invasive plants. So the community was afraid to go down there because the invasive plant thickets, you couldn't access the river, you couldn't see the river from the banks, there was no way to get down there. So that's actually how Tamarisk Coalition Riverside West was started, was to remove those plants. And now that the invasive plants have been removed, the whole city has just jumped on board with recognizing the river as a community asset. It's a great thing to have, but now we have a riverfront trail going through there, we've got a business park going in, just endless bounds of development as a result of this one part in the process, which was getting rid of those invasive plants. And the community realized, oh, this is a beautiful place that we can recreate and interact with, so I don't know, it's just pretty neat. So, all right, well, so the ways that we get rid of it, again, all hope is not lost, there's lots of ways. Mechanical removal is a quick way to do it. We've got big machines to take out the tamarisk. We've got conservation corps crews that we will hire, and they'll go out for a couple weeks at a time sometimes. This is primarily used especially when we can't get heavy machinery in there. Great skill building opportunities for youth and really hard work. But once they remove the top half of the plant, if they can't, this is an ideal situation where they get the whole plant here and the roots included. If you don't get that tap root, it'll just keep growing back. So if they do just cut the top half down with the chainsaw, you'll need to apply some herbicide or else the plant will just continually keep coming. So they'll apply it just to the cambium living layer of the tree, and that it'll kind of bleed down into the roots and kill the rest of the plant. And then after that, there is the third way that we work to control it is by a natural predator of tamarisk. Is anyone familiar with the tamarisk beetle in here? Okay, so they introduced something from another country to help manage an invasive plant, which is kind of like a red flag. Oh, that's a little scary, right? Because usually it doesn't always go well. But the great thing with this tamarisk beetle is that I think at this point the USDA really learned their lesson, and they researched 200 different beetles for 20 years. And they finally found one they were sure was the pickiest eater, and it is. It's a specialist, so it only eats tamarisk. And the nice thing about this is usually when you introduce another thing into the country, it'll jump host to something similar, and that's when you have the backfire. But the good thing is that there are no other plants that are similar to tamarisk in the United States, so it's not jumping host to anything else because there's nothing like it here. So that's a good thing. And it does its job really well. So USDA did release it. Riverside doesn't release the beetles. We monitor and track its progress. We help landowners deal with it when it does come through their property. And this is what it looks like with our just monotypic stand of all tamarisk. This was outside in Moab. In 1 month's time, the beetle will come through. They're attracted by pheromones, and the beetle will come through and eat the leaves of the tamarisk plant, and it'll be left looking like this, nice and browned out. So it's pretty drastic contrast. And this is when they're doing their most damage, is in their 3 larval stages. Just eating the leaves, and then as adults, this is what they look like. And they don't bite or anything. You can have them crawling all over you, but there are a lot of beetles that look very similar to this, that feed on cottonwood trees and stuff like that. So they're easily confused, but we assure you it's just tamarisk beetles eating tamarisk. So the beetle will defoliate those tamarisk trees, and then the plant is not dead. So the plant has energy reserves stored in its roots, and it'll use those energy reserves to refoliate. And it'll look like that top picture after they come through, but then that next spring or within the growing season, you'll see this patchy grow back, kind of like poodle puffs we call it, of the tamarisk trying to grow out new leaves. And this can eventually, the beetles will come back again and will redefoliate that, and they'll just keep coming back to those tamarisk plants. Eventually, depending on where this plant is located along the river, the tamarisk beetles can kill the tamarisk plant. And And really, even if it doesn't, it still knocks it back enough that instead of spending all its energy producing seeds, it's now spending all its energy just trying to get more leaves back out. So it is a really cost-effective tool for the management of tamarisk because they're out in the system now, they're just doing their thing, and it's been really interesting to watch this kind of unfold. And this picture here, I was out in the Dolores River this last fall, and this is kind of the tamarisk skeletons that get left behind when they do eventually die. And you'll start to see, a little hard to tell, but this is New Mexico privet, a native plant, coming up under the tamarisk understory. So these native plants are coming back through the skeletons of tamarisk. So there's that, and we also work with land managers, so if they don't want to let this happen, which is still good, we help them to remove patches of the dead tamarisk and then replace it with the native plants in segments. So that's ideal when we can. But,
Kara, I have a question.
yeah.
The one slide prior to this one?
Uh-huh.
Oh, sorry, not that one. That one, yeah,
Yeah.
sorry. I guess it was 3 super prior.
Yeah.
Do you know about like how big of an area that is and how many beetles they release? Did you say that and I just spaced out for a second?
I don't actually know the number. So they released, it's a good question, how many they released at one time. Massive amounts.
And do they like shake them out all over like the corridor, or they don't like just dump them in one spot and they spread, or?
They, I don't know how many they've released in each, this was in 2001, I think, when they did this or so. But yeah, I mean, like thousands of beetles, I would imagine. I don't know for sure. The Palisade Insectary, which is also located, it was in Palisade, but they're the ones who actually do the releasing of the beetles. But yeah, so, and there's massive amounts of them, and their populations are fluctuating. So now that, right now the state that we're in is the tamarisk are dying back. So the beetles have less food, so their populations are declining with the tamarisk population that's declining. So then the tamarisk will start to grow back, and the beetle population will grow, and then they'll just kind of follow this cyclical cycle. So, yeah, but as far as like how many, I don't know. We could actually see in some of the maps that we produce, in the early year maps, there was a reference to the number of actual beetles that were found. In our newer maps, we stopped doing that, we're just doing presence or absence monitoring. So if they're here, yes, if they're not here, but we used to count them a lot, so. Which I think I have a slide, yeah, I do have some to show. So these are the maps that we produce. So this is the yellow at this point, we're 1 to 4 beetles, and then 26 to 500 beetles is a larger establishment. I'm pretty sure that's what that's going after. But this is where they originally were released. And then there was an illegal release in southern Utah, St. George area. So that was a bit of an issue because there are bird species that do rely on nesting in tamarisk now. Birds that nested in willows, all of a sudden don't have willows, they have tamarisk, so they adapt and they nest in tamarisk. So there's 2 endangered birds actually that are impacted by that, but they primarily live in this region over here. So the USDA did not think that the beetles would be able to move that fast, and they were assuming that by the time the beetle did reach these endangered species habitats, that they would have plans in place to deal with it. Unfortunately, there was an illegal release that kind of sped up the movement of the tamarisk beetle, so it got pushed into that territory a lot quicker. But this is it through the years, as you can kind of see, 2008. And expanding, all these red dots are large establishments of the beetle. This was an intentional release out here. And then we kind of keep going through the years. And fast forward to 2018, this is our most recent map. All of the bluish ones are places where we sampled in 2018 where we did find beetles present. So it's not quite along the Gila River, which is where a lot of endangered bird habitat is, so that's good, there's still some time. But it's definitely an unintended consequence of this beetle introduction. It's just that impact bird habitat. So I kind of have a slide here to chat about that for a second, but I mentioned southwestern willow flycatcher, western yellow-billed cuckoo are the 2 species that are primarily affected by it. And the way that they're impacted by this basically is that the birds are nesting in the tamarisk, and when the beetles come in to foliate it, all of a sudden there's no leaves. So there's no leaves to protect their nests, so they're now exposed to predation, and the temperatures are higher because they don't have the shade from the leaves. So we're seeing higher mortality. Overall though, we still know and are still finding that the willows and the cuckoos, they still survive, they have higher survival rates in willows versus tamarisk. So when they're nesting in tamarisk, they're getting attacked by cowbirds way more, 3 times higher from these birds that basically nest in their nests. So there's definitely goods and bads with that scenario, but in the end, we know that even though it's hard right now, these birds will be better off when they have more willows to nest in. They'll have better survival rates. But we're just working with land managers to try to prepare them for that and provide good habitat in the meantime. So, any questions on that? Any thoughts? Okay, cool. So, just to do a quick plug about River's Edge and what we do in restoration, we talked about the problem, we talked about how we're removing it and whatnot, and replanting native plants is really important. But our role kind of is an umbrella for all this work. So there's a lot of money that goes behind this and funding this work, applying for it, hiring crews to do it. So we start off with helping to plan and fundraise for this work. Last year we raised $1.5 million for 9 watershed partnerships all across the West doing this work. And we start and help boost a lot of partnerships doing this work. So we work in the Verde River with the Verde Watershed Partnership, the Gila Watershed Partnership. We kind of help guide them in their practices and make them more successful at what they're doing. We also coordinate 2 partnerships ourselves. So we're actually running the Desert Rivers Collaborative, which is in Mesa County and Delta County. And then we're also leading the Dolores River Restoration Partnership on the Dolores River. So we're actually the lead collaborators on that, and we get all these different landowners at the table. It is really hard. Rivers don't know boundaries, obviously, so we have 4 BLM offices, numerous private landowners. I mean, it's such a difference to get everyone at the table versus everyone trying to do it on their own. And that's kind of where we come in, is to bring everybody together, kind of like a kumbaya moment, if you will, but like we're all in this to help improve the health of this river. And you can get a lot more funding when you apply together as a group. That's another perk behind that. So then we also obviously coordinate the native plant restoration, and we work on some research projects on what restoration is best. We do a big component of our work is to educate and conduct monitoring of this work and share the lessons that we find from it. So we host an annual conference every year with like 200 people, land managers and scientists. People come from 15 different states, multiple countries to this conference just to find out what's happening in the field and how they can improve their restoration practices. So it's a pretty unique conference. There's really not another conference around that's doing that kind of work, focused just on this field, this topic. And then the last piece is obviously education and stewardship. So, we can do all this work and try to keep back the invasive plants in Grand Junction, but, eventually we're going to need the community to buy in and get on board as well and help out with these projects, whether they fund it financially or they get out and actually help in volunteer events. So that's another component, and you're welcome to visit our website for any more info on what we do. We have most of the social medias going, so you should check that out. And then with that, I did want to show you some Riverside Stories. I think I'll show that to you at the end, because I did want to talk a little bit about our partnerships that we're working with, and just to give you a visual of who they are and where they're located. So we, all of these blobs, these colored blobs, represent a watershed partnership that's working on this problem of invasive plants along our rivers and restoring habitat. So this is just a sampling of the ones that we work with. There's more out there than that, but we currently don't have enough capacity to say we have restored X amount of acres across all rivers in the West. There's just so many groups doing good stuff, we just don't have that number. But when we look at what success is, we know that there's all these awesome organizations doing this work to combat this problem. So it's pretty amazing to see how much we're accomplishing together. So And then the last thing I'll talk about before I show you the videos is just one pretty pertinent topic is adapting to changing climate conditions. So we've got longer periods of drought. We've got just changing weather patterns. So what are we going to do? So this picture up here, this is actually in New Mexico, along the Rio Grande. And I have a land manager there who has this huge, beautiful cottonwood gallery, and we love them. And they're very significant culturally for tribal people as well, so these cottonwoods. And now we're seeing this massive dieback of these cottonwood trees. So this is in the same property in just a different area where these cottonwoods are just not surviving. So we've got some big questions on our hands as to what's happening to our rivers and why is this happening, and I think a lot of it comes back to hydrology, over hydrology of course, but what are we going to do in the wake of this change happening? Should we still really be planting cottonwoods when sometimes in this site, when obviously we know that they're not going to survive, and if not, what should we plant instead? So our role at Rivers Edge West really is to help figure out those answers. We're talking with scientists to connect them, connect the scientists finding these things out with the land managers on the ground who are actually doing the work. So you can have a ton of publications out there about best practices, but the land managers don't have time to read that. They don't know. They're not necessarily hunting down the internet for this kind of stuff. So we act as a clearinghouse for that information so folks can find out. So here, again, this whole picture, this is a different photo. This is actually in Arizona. But this cottonwood die-off, well, why did all these die? That's a great question, but an even better question is why did that one survive? So these scientists are studying what like genetics and adaptations does that one cottonwood have that allowed that one to survive, and let's get more of those. Let's figure out what that plant has. So a lot of these scientists are doing some really great research. We've talked about, and there's a lot of people that are moving plants from lower elevations to higher elevations. So we're taking New Mexico privet and using it now. That's something that historically has lived on the upper floodplains with less water, but still does really well in the riparian zone. So just thinking about not just doing the same thing that we've always done, because that likely isn't going to keep working for very long. So yeah, I think that's generally the gist of it. We have some land managers that are actually looking at, I want to restore for an ecosystem service, like I just want to restore, well not just, but one of the things I want to restore for is for pollinators. So I want to make sure I have plants that are going to be flowering at all different times throughout the year to provide suitable habitat for them. I'm going to make sure I'm not using chemicals on my weed treatments and just restoring for that particular service. So just looking at restoration a little differently, because I think a lot of people get stuck in the same hole. So pretty neat. Is there any questions about the climate stuff? Oh, cool. Okay. Well, with that said, I'm going to show you a couple of videos. I'm really, this is a little selfish because this was my favorite project that I've worked on this year. With the stewardship piece, we're just trying to raise broader awareness about why we do what we do and the people behind it. So we created this Riverside Stories series that kind of tells little snippets of it. So I'm going to show you two under 2-minute videos. And the first one is actually Emily Caston. She is basically a program coordinator for the Southwest Conservation Corps, and she wears a million hats like most people in this field, but we got to follow her out in the field for a day, and you're just going to kind of hear a little bit about what she does. I'm just going to exit out of here. Let's see if I can find my mouse. Okay. So you can hear about that. I don't know if did we turn our sound off, or maybe I did? I did. Sorry.
Opportunities vetted.
Okay. There you go.
I enjoy rivers because of the companions and the opportunities that it has created. I like knowing what's in my environment, nerding out about plants, and it's a unique way to intimately get to know the landscape. When I think of rivers, I think of life in general. It's like the source, especially out here in this environment that can be so harsh, so dry. And then you get down to the river and it's like this cool, refreshing, kind of relaxing place. My name is Emily Caston, and I'm the Watershed Program Coordinator for Southwest Conservation Corps. I started out on a saw crew and didn't really know that I was gonna fall in love with this type of work. My main focus is on the Dolores River Restoration Partnership and the work surrounding that. This river flows across 2 states, and there's a lot of collaboration because of that. Riverside West is one of our partners on this river, so is the Southwest Conservation Corps, which I'm a part of. This water resource is here for everybody, and everybody depends on it. Really like how we provide for, you know, all these young people coming out of school and whatnot that really don't maybe have a clear idea of what they want to do. My favorite part of the job is getting to go out and hike around and do the vegetation monitoring. It's a way to track progress on sites that have been treated for tamarisk. Tamarisk, it armors the bank and it prevents a natural flood regime where nothing else is really able to get in and establish and survive. What we're doing out here is really benefiting local communities, it's benefiting people that want to come out here and recreate, it's benefiting wildlife. And the fact that we're over such a large landscape, it really is truly having an impact on the whole watershed.
Okay, so that's our first video. Internet's a little shaky, so sorry about that. But you can go to our website at Rivers Edge West, and that'll show you a whole slew of stories that we did. It's just been really interesting telling the stories of the individuals behind the work. So I would show you Bill's, but since it's so choppy, I'll just say that you should go online and watch it yourself and share it. And we're going to be releasing 3 more videos in addition to those 2. So if you want to learn more, you should visit our website and sign up for our newsletter. I send out 1 a month that has information with that Riverside Stories series, or just follow us on Facebook or whatnot, and you can see those. So, yeah. Do you have any other questions about anything I talked about? Yeah.
Did you do much work with the Nature Conservancy
We
down
have.
in Colorado Springs on the Verde River?
On the Verde River.
The Verde River.
So Friends of the Verde River is a partnership that is heading up that whole effort, and I'm not familiar with as much of their partners that they're working with, but I do know that I literally have a video of Chip Norton, who is a member of Friends of the Verde River, and they actually, in the video, go on a conserved property with the Nature Conservancy to show some of the work that's been done. So I know they have partnered with them, but in what capacity, personally, I'm not familiar. But yeah, we do a lot of work with them. We work with the Nature Conservancy out of Norton as well. So it's all about partnerships, basically. I mean, all working together. So yeah, they're a great group. Yeah. Any other questions?
Yeah, so you were talking about how tamarisk can move, and a lot of it is seed dispersal, either floating downstream in the water or blowing through the air.
Mm-hmm.
Do you guys know, so I'm guessing tamarisk can move both upstream and downstream? Does it move one direction more easily than the other?
I don't know any particular studies that come to mind about that. I think it's something that's probably been covered at one of our conferences. My guess is it's going to be more downstream, just naturally, but yeah, that is a downside. I mean, you want to start and work your way down, but in a lot of cases it's going to be blowing in either direction, so it's kind of difficult. But I would assume, based on what I do know, that it would be more prevalent downstream. Yeah, but it's a good question. Yeah. Our resource center, for anyone that wants to find cool articles. So we have a resource center on our website. That's just a library of all these articles kind of about this field. So if you ever want to learn more about it, there's probably something in there for you. Yeah.
Are you seeing tamarisk, or let's just say tamarisk for now, spreading into areas that are surprising Like, are they going higher elevation, and are they
Yeah.
going beyond the riparian areas?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. They're going, they can survive in many places beyond the riparian zone. So that's one of the big issues is that, it might not be surprising at this point because we just in the field kind of know that, where there's soil, there could be tamarisk. They could survive on very little. So, yeah, there's a lot of areas where you normally wouldn't have these large woody species drinking a lot of water, and now we have tamarisk. And like I mentioned, on the upper floodplains, they definitely survive up there. So, and they outcompete those plants as well. So, it goes far beyond the riparian zone. Oh, yeah. I'll go to you and then I'll come back to you. Okay, cool. Okay.
I know you talked about the specific actions that you're taking to remove tamarisk. How do you feel in general with the success of it? Like, do they come back, or do you feel like when you guys get in there and pull them up with the machines and use the herbicides, is it a pretty high success rate that they're gone and they're gone for good, or?
Yeah, so the big thing about it is it depends on who's managing the property. So since we don't actually own the land, we work as kind of a, help them through the process. So we can tell them, the land manager, we're gonna remove your tamarisk and hire crews and help you do that, put the herbicide on, it'll kill the plant. But inevitably, there will be resprouts, potentially if you miss a spot with herbicide, if there's other seeds that are left in the ground, there will need to be follow-up. And oftentimes, they are the ones that need to be doing the follow-up, the ones who manage the land themselves. That's just not something that we have the capacity to do. So I think when you have, we work with some really dedicated land managers out there who really put in a lot of effort despite their lack of capacity. And when we work with those people, we see huge improvements to, riverside habitat and really good success. The biggest component of it is that it just takes time. So when the tamarisk is knocked back, you get secondary weeds that come in oftentimes. So before the soil kind of amends itself, before the native plants get a chance to grow back, you'll get kochia that comes back in. You'll get cheatgrass or just these smaller secondary weeds. And that is something that they also need to be aware of, that we educate, is that be ready, because save some funding and time, because once this is over, there's going to be a second slew, basically, your second installment of weeds. So that's a really big piece to this work, is managing the secondary weeds that come in after you get the big ones out. But once that's done, down the road, it does look great, and the invasive plants and the secondary weeds stay gone. They don't come back. We've got a pollinator garden in Grand Junction that we helped to plant over 1,200 native plants for pollinators. First year was great. Second year, covered in kochia. Even though we had established these native plants, we were just like, oh my gosh, all of our plants are just covered in kochia. Well, we gathered volunteers, we did a bunch of events and ripped out the kochia. And then 3 years later, the whole garden is covered in the native plants again, and kochia is nowhere to be seen, and it's just beautiful. So it just takes a consistent effort, and that's what we try to promote and instill in these land managers, and just try to help them any way that we can, because oftentimes this is one slice of their whole job. So if we can help save their time and energy and make it more efficient for them, it really does work out well in the long run. But yeah, that's a long answer. Yeah.
Are there any insects or animals that do really well or adapt really well to tamarisk? And do you see that areas with a lot of that pulling in other invasive species, or?
So in terms of what insects do well in tamarisk or other species, insects, they'll live in tamarisk. Definitely the composition of the insects do change in terms of which ones prefer it versus others. I think the biggest thing, this might be a little bit off your question, but I think this is an interesting topic to bring up, is that for Russian olive, for example, the Russian olive seeds that drop into the river, fish, they've actually cut open samples of native fish, and they do not eat the Russian olives. They're not found in their stomachs. The stomachs they are found in is invasive carp. So the carp love Russian olive seeds they find, and so then the carp actually, they ended up replacing them. Once they poop them out, they're still viable, the seeds are still good. So you're really just transplanting it. An invasive species is feeding another invasive species, and that invasive plant or fish is helping the invasive plant spread. But, you know, I have seen like turkeys that nest in Russian olive. They actually will like smash down the crown of the Russian olive and nest in there on the tops. If you ever go down like the San Juan River, that happens a lot over there. But other than that, I mean, impacts, there's not many other bird species that are preferring it at all. I think it's more of just the adaptation of no other choice. But yeah, and there's a lot of research out there still underway in terms of the insect populations. But yeah, that's a good question. Yeah. And birds will feed on the tamarisk beetle as well, so it's an additional food source for them. So yeah. Anything else? Okay.
Chad, do you maybe want to just address
Oh,
it
yeah.
for a few minutes to talk
Sure.
about some local work you've done, and then Rick, I think, has a couple more things to add after you.
Yeah. So part of this leads to my question about how tamarisk move, whether they move upstream, downstream, what they do more effectively. We do have tamarisk in the Roaring Fork watershed. Most of it is concentrated downstream, down valley, in the Glenwood area in particular, particularly along the Colorado River in Glenwood Springs, but we have found small pockets along the lower Roaring Fork, kind of in the Glenwood area. And I've been made aware of this through a number of different ways, in particular through concerned citizens who notice it, who can identify it, reach out to us and let us know about this. So we have been partnering off and on for a number of years now with some other agencies to kind of see what we can do about it. And one of the groups that we've been working with a lot is Roaring Fork Outdoor Volunteers. I'm going to guess that a number of you might be familiar with that organization. They're an organization that focuses a lot on being able to mobilize large groups of volunteers to do a lot of trail work. So they do trail maintenance work, they do trail construction work, they work all throughout the entire Roaring Fork watershed and even beyond. They work a lot with our government agencies like the BLM and the Forest Service. But in addition to their trail work, they will also do some other projects. We have done some wetland planting projects with them before, and now we've done some tamarisk removal projects with them. So this is an area where, since we're not as much in the trail building business, we like to work with them in the areas that we overlap. So like I said, some wetland planting projects and tamarisk removal. So we worked with them, it would be a few years ago now, maybe in 2016 or 2017, we worked with them to do a tamarisk removal project down in Glenwood Springs. And they focused on the Colorado River through Glenwood, and particularly West Glenwood. And then there's some pockets on the Roaring Fork River, kind of in the area near, if you know Glenwood fairly well, kind of in the area near the airport, and particularly near where 3 Mile Creek joins the Roaring Fork River. There were some pockets of tamarisk in there. So we worked together with Roaring Fork Outdoor Volunteers to mobilize the volunteers. We worked with Garfield County, and they provided us with some staff to help out. And in particular, as Kara was saying, we had the manpower to cut the plants. The city and the county were taking them and literally hauling them off-site as best as we could. And then they had licensed applicators, so to put the chemical on that you need to try and kill the plant, you have to have a special applicator with a special license to work with those chemicals, and they would come along and paint them and spray them after we cut them. So we did this a couple of years ago, and actually 3 or 4, maybe even 5 years prior to that. So over the course of 2 times of working in this area, I actually was able to notice a significant difference in how many tamarisks there were. Now, it is an incredibly resilient plant, and you've probably seen, we saw times where you cut it back, you spray it very well with this chemical, pretty powerful chemical, and yet it still manages to come back from that. And even sometimes it can take multiple times of cutting and retreating before you really can knock back some of these plants. But it's exciting to see over the course of a couple of times that we are making a difference. And the second time that we went into these same areas, the plants were much smaller, much less established. Some of them, they were small enough we were able to literally pull them out by the roots. You know, so it takes time, and as you were saying, it takes diligence but to stick with it. But we are starting to see some gains in those areas. Another thing I was a part of is we worked with the NRCS and actually did a float through Glenwood Springs and mapped where we saw tamarisk. And literally to the point of having a GPS unit and like putting little points on our GPS of where we saw these plants. And they're definitely in small concentrated pockets. And one thing we noticed of interest in the Glenwood Springs area is Glenwood has a very diverse area through town, and you have some pockets of very, very good riparian habitat. Some of the things we were talking about at the beginning was diverse plants, lots of multi-storied habitat, a real nice wide variety. And in those areas we saw very little tamarisk. And in the more disturbed areas in Glenwood where humans have altered the riparian area more, they've taken out a lot of the native plants and put in other things, or where there's been erosion and there's been less of the native plants around, those were the areas where we noticed more pockets of these tamarisk in those areas. So in some ways, a healthy riparian area we saw didn't have as much tamarisk. It seems like it had a little more trouble in those areas. So that's kind of what we're seeing in our watershed, is right now it's concentrated in the Down Valley area. I have heard reports from people of tamarisk in other spots in our watershed. It's sometimes hard to know how well the people can identify the plant tamarisk, and if they really know if they're seeing that plant, or sometimes how it got there. I've heard of tamarisk being in kind of unusual places. We heard about some near some water tanks, completely away from any rivers, that was part of a water supply for a housing area. And there was enough water from those tanks leaking or in the area, enough moisture that, and I don't know how the tamarisk got to that point, but we occasionally hear reports of small pockets of tamarisk around, but right now we're fairly lucky in that in a lot of our healthy river systems, particularly in our higher elevations, we don't seem to have a lot of tamarisk. It seems to be concentrated in along the bigger rivers and the lower in the watershed is kind of what we're seeing right now. Any questions on that? We've had, like I said, we've had good luck working with a couple of partner agencies on that. I know Roaring Fork Outdoor Volunteers also has done some tamarisk removal projects farther down valley, like in the Newcastle and the Rifle area. It's more pronounced as you move downstream that direction. Since that's not a part of the Roaring Fork watershed, we haven't partnered as much on those, but I know that there's been work done in that part of our valley as well. I think that, no questions there.
Yes, sir. Sure.
Okay.
Thanks, Chad. Well, thanks, Kara, and it's very important work that you're doing, of course. As Chad said, we don't have quite the invasion of tamarisk as what we have seen in some unusual places. I think before Chad's long tenure here, mine's just a little bit longer, but we did get our first report of tamarisk in the watershed up by Penny Hot Springs by Redstone, believe it or not. And so how it got there was a mystery. At that time, Pickens County Open Space and Trails did eradicate it. I was the one who found the tree by the water tank that Chad was talking about. And it's, if you know where Aspen Glen is, it's the other side of Aspen Glen. And that was a magnificent specimen. Not a good thing, but it was a huge tree. So how it was off anybody's radar was a mystery. And we've seen little individual imposters show up every once in a while, and some others. A bigger challenge we have in the watershed is Russian olive, and I'm sure you've seen those, but Russian olive was an approved landscape cultivar for a long time. So if you go through the West Bank subdivision, for example, it is rampant there, and it has, of course, gotten down to the riverbank as well, too. So we are not free from any of those issues. I think a bigger, important issue that we talk about a lot here, as you're looking out the door at our mature and decadent cottonwood stands, is that we are also suffering from the critical overbanking flows to stimulate the cottonwood galleries. And so what we have here is a magnificent gallery, but we have an old, even-age stand without a lot of recruitment. And it's not visible to everyone. The cottonwoods seem fine here. We describe it as more of death by 1,000 cuts, though. And It's not only climate change, but water moving in all directions. If you were here for our first Watershed Institute's speaking engagement with Chris Trees, we talked a lot about the Colorado River and the compact and the fact that there are straws and pipes and things moving water in a lot of different directions. And so what we suffer from here in the Roaring Fork Valley as overbanking flows go is that we have 2 of the 5 largest trans-basin diversion systems or tunnels moving water from the western slope to the eastern slope. So we're already losing that overbanking flow, that potential, because the amount of water is not there. But as you can see, this is largely tamarisk, as we've seen and heard tonight. It's a very important role that you guys are playing. Thank you for coming and talking to us this evening and educating us about tamarisk and what's going on. It is certainly encouraging. Chad and I have been there for these Roaring Fork Outdoor Volunteer Partnerships. We've seen, how hard it is to simply just mechanically remove it with saws and things like that, how quickly the chemical applicator must follow right behind the cutter, or else the tree seals itself off and starts to regenerate. So I was just saying you could make a career out of killing tamarisk, and now you have. So it's really not a joke anymore, which is great. And it is encouraging to hear that there are other species that are eating the beetles and things like that, and then there is actually some habitat value associated with it, although I know it's denuded a lot of habitat as well too. But there's hope thanks to groups like you and all the important partnerships. So thank you again for coming. Thank you everybody for coming. Thank you to Right Water Engineers, our sponsor for this evening. Thank you, of course, to Free Range to provide us with the wine and the lovely charcuterie trays. If you're in Basalt and looking for a great place to go have dinner after, or just a glass of wine or a drink, Free Range is a great, great spot, and they're a great partner of ours. So, Christina, would you like to add something?
Just, can you please just add and tell people about the RFOV and RFC planting day on June 15th for where the Lake Christine wildfire happened? Because
Yes.
it's not related to tamarisk, but kind of is, right? So just to kind of introduce that, maybe save the date.
Yes, so June 15th, we will have a volunteer seeding and erosion control project. Why aren't we planting? Because replanting an old growth pinyon juniper forest is not effective. What we need to do is get ground cover to come up and abate the weeds, just as Kara talked about after they do something. So this landscape is changed forever in our lifetime and probably our children's lifetime. Those pinyon juniper trees grow very, very slowly, so you're not going to get a high amount of success in replanting, but we will get success in working with Colorado Parks and Wildlife right here outside of town to help with erosion control measures that they are putting into place through catchment basins and check dams and everything. Our biggest concern, of course, is mud and ash being mobilized and getting into the river. And working on erosion control and certainly seeding areas will help keep a lot of soil intact. So we're hoping for literally hundreds of people to come out for that day.
So I'm on the RFOV marketing team, volunteer team. It will be capped. I mean, they're expecting at least 250 people to volunteer for the June 15th project, but they're expecting more than 250 people to be interested. So if you're interested in volunteering, I encourage you to sign up earlier than later.
Thank you.
All right.
Anybody have anything else to add? Okay, we got refreshments for about 30 people tonight, so don't take a rotor with you, a road soda, or a road plate, whatever you think you want to eat. I don't encourage you to